Okay, so we will look today at the last parsha in the Torah. This is the one section of the Torah that is not read on Shabbat. It is read at the conclusion of the Torah, and it's beginning on Simchat Torah. It is Moses' farewell blessing to the people. I want to ask everybody to mute because I do hear something maybe I'll even do it. Okay, so okay, everyone is now muted. As I was saying, this is only read on Simchat Torah, and it consists of Moses's farewell blessing to the people, and it in some ways is the companion piece to Ha'azinu, which we looked at last time. Ha'azinu and even the section before, really Moses is prophesying rather dire things that are going to happen to the people. They're going to be faithless. They're going to be punished. It's a dour view ahead. You almost have the sense of Moses is now burnt out. He has led these people for so long in their various rebellions, and he's predicting that pattern will go on. But that's not the last word. And the last word is actually words of blessing, much more positive, much more optimistic. In some ways, the juxtaposition of these parshiot is in some sense like what we saw right before that, which were the blessings and the curses, right? So we've looked at the negative, and now we're going to look at the positive. This idea of a farewell blessing to the tribes, and that's what we're going to see. Each tribe mentioned, well, I wouldn't say each tribe, mentioned individually, as you'll see, is some combination, but reminds us of Jacob on his deathbed, where he also blesses the tribes. And in some sense, predicts what will come of them. This is even a purer blessing. Unlike the previous parsha, it doesn't seem to have the form of predictions more than it has the form of wishes. A blessing in the sense of the things that I wish for you. We're going to start. We're at chapter 33. We're on page 1202. 1202. Zot habracha asher berech Moshe ish ha'Elohim et bnei Yisrael. So this is the blessing which Moses, and he's given an interesting title here, Ish ha'Elohim, the man of God, right? This suggests that Moses, at the very end, we're going to hear him be called Eved Adonai, God's servant. But here, there seems to be almost more than that, almost a sense of Moses having, in some small way, joined with God, that he is a man, not a divine, but having achieved a status that is more than human. And if you think about it, for example, looking back to the book of Numbers, when Moses goes up to the mountain, he comes back and his face is shining, right? So much so that he has to wear a veil to protect the people, right? So that sense that he's been transformed into something that is slightly more than human by his close encounters with the divine. Now, he's pictured through most of the Torah as very human and is making mistakes and so on. And yet, there seems to be a sense here of something more than that. So, Isha Elohim, man of God, And he did this in order to bless them before his death. So here we get a sense that this is really a deathbed blessing. But unlike Jacob, who is very, very frail at the end of his life, Moses, we're going to see, is not in that position. He is not going to die of natural causes through this frailty. He is actually going to die because God has decreed it. Okay, and then we get a description. So we're going to look at this poem really has three parts. The first part is a sort of general introduction before we get to the listing of the tribes. And then we'll have the listing of the tribes and Moses' blessing for them. And then the last section will be kind of a summary speaking to the whole people of Israel. And then after that, we'll actually get the death of Moses. So, okay, this is what God says. Moses says about God. God, the Lord came from Sinai. He shone from Seir. He appeared on Mount Paran and approached this place called Merivot Kodesh. So the image here is God coming out of Sinai, God coming out of the Negev. And the idea here is that God, and how is he doing that? Lightning flashing at them from his right? So God somehow is joined with lightning. We have this image. This isn't the image of Sinai per se, but the image of God, and we see this in Ezekiel particularly, that God has a kind of aura about it. And this idea of lightning is somehow connected to that. How does he travel, right? Because this envisions God who is coming now out of Sinai to fight for his people, because God will be coming to be, as it says in the Song at the Sea, Ish Milchama, a man of war. He's coming in to be with them in the battle ahead. And how does he do that? There's a lot of imagery in the Torah and in the Bible in general that God comes in a cloud, in a wind, and specifically in a chariot. We have this image of God, and you, if you know the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, which we read on Shavuot, among other times, we have this image of God on this chariot with these magnificent beasts that are drawing it. This kind of imagery we know from the ancient Near East. We see it in other cultures as well. And here God is coming, and God is described here as Chovev Amim, a lover, that God is not, this is not just the relationship between God and the people is not merely that of a king and a vassal, but it is in some sense a love relationship, a parental relationship, one of care. And so he is a lover of people. Their hallowed are all in your hand, that is the people. They followed in your steps, accepted your pronouncements. And then we get this line, which seems very strange here, right? Moshe Tziva Torah Sivanu Moshe Morasha Kihilat Yaakov. It's a phrase that may be familiar to you. It's used liturgically. And according to the rabbis, this phrase is something that should be taught to a young child at the very beginning, along with the Shema. These were the two things when you're putting your kid to bed. I think most of us know about the Shema, but this verse also. And this idea that Moses, I talked about him as Ish Elohim, like the man of God, but that Moses has such a critical role. He's such a towering figure, right? That here, even here, he's mentioned. That, of course, raises the problem. Why isn't he mentioned in the Haggadah? But that's a whole other subject. But here, now the problem with this verse is that Moses is doing this poem, right? He's the one who's speaking. And then Torah Tzivanu Moshe, Moses charged us with the Torah. Up to this point, it's made sense that it's Moses who's speaking. But how is Moses? This reminds me, sometimes you hear politicians who sort of refer to themselves in the third person. You know what I'm talking about? I think Bob Dole was like this, those of you remember. He would say, Bob Dole wouldn't do X or Y when he's really saying I, right? And this sounds kind of like that. I don't think that's what's going on here. The commentators really struggle to figure out what this is. And one of the things that they say, and I like this a lot, is that this is the people's response. Moses is saying this blessing, which is a poem, essentially. And at a certain point, when Moses says, they followed your steps and now accepting your pronouncements, and then the people say, Torah Tzivanu Moshe, Moses charged us the heritage of his congregation. Now, the term heritage, morashah here, generally refers to land. It's physical. But here, Torah is the heritage. Torah is the inheritance. And that's striking also because they're about to go into the land, right? But the focus here is not on the land. The focus is on the Torah. That is the true inheritance of the people of Israel. And then we get, then he became king in Yeshurun. Now remember that Yeshurun is a name for the people of Israel, right? So it's not a place. God became Israel's king, right? Directly. And this becomes later on, and we see this particularly in the book of Samuel. The people will come to Samuel and they'll say, let us have a king like all the other nations. And Samuel resists. We are different than all other nations. He doesn't say these words, but I think the sense of it is, we are different than all other nations. We don't have an earthly king. We shouldn't have an earthly king. God is the king. And God eventually permits it. But and Samuel does a wonderful thing talking about what kings are going to do. He sounds like a good Republican. He says they're going to tax you, right? All of the kinds of things about, big government, right? So Samuel there is saying it's not good. Theologically, it's wrong. Practically, you will suffer because God is the king in Yeshurun among the people of Israel. When the heads of the tribes assembled, the tribes of Israel, and this sense of a kind of coronation, that all of Israel came together and accepted God's kingship. Essentially, that's what we do, of course, on Rosh Hashanah, right? When we come together, and Rosh Hashanah, the anniversary of the creation of human beings, becomes the moment when God is a king because they were subjects. Right. So here, and we blow the shofar for a variety of reasons, but one of them is a kind of coronation trumpet. So the heads of the people assemble, the tribes of Israel together, and now we have this sort of general introduction, and now we're going to get a list of the tribes, and Moses has something to say about them. Some of them, it's just a line or two. We're going to start with Reuven, who gets the shortest of these blessings, And Reuven is not actually in the land of Israel. He's outside. That's where he gets his land. And he becomes, the tribe of Reuven eventually becomes quite small. It seems like it might even be assimilated along with the tribe of Gad. And so Moses' blessing for Reuven is that they not be subsumed, right? May they live and not die. I think the sense here is not physical death, right? But losing their tribal identity. That's Reuven. We're done. So why does he go first? He's the firstborn. So, okay. And this he said of Judah. Hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, and restore him to his people. You could say, well, why isn't he there with his people? I think the idea here is restore him to his people. Judah is going out into battle. He's going to ask God's protection, hear that request for protection, and allow him to come back safely. Though his own hands strive for him, help him against his foe, right? So we see a kind of parallelism there. And now we move on to Levi. And of Levi, he said, let your Urim and, here it's Tumim and Urim. Usually earlier in the Torah, they were referred to as Urim and Tumim. Here they're Tumim and Urim. Be with your faithful one, that is Levi, who you tested at Massa. So what are the Urim and Tumim? They are a means of, it's a kind of invoking an oracle, as in some sense. It enables you to determine God's will. Now remember, God's not going to be talking anymore, right? So how do we know what God thinks or what God wants? Or we're going to see this very directly in the book of Joshua when they're used, so you can look forward to that. They seem to have been in the breastplate of the high priest. And remember, the tribe of Levi is the priestly tribe. They seem to be in the breastplate of the high priest, and they are lots that can be cast, right? So each lot would have the name of a tribe, for example, and one would be pulled out. And then we could go on to smaller and smaller divisions until, and you see this in the book of Joshua, we get to an individual, right? But the idea is it's like drawing lots in order to determine God's will. And the priests, that's one of the major roles of the priest. I should also say that in the Torah in general, even though we think of the Kohanim, who are the descendants of Aaron, as the priests, as opposed to the Levites, it seems that the tribe of Levi also has a kind of priestly role. That distinction between a Kohen and a Levi, every Kohen is a Levi, of course, that distinction is very loose in the Bible. And it seems like the tribe of Levi also can have this priestly function. Although here, when we talk about Tumim and Urim, we're really talking about the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And now it says about Levi that he was tested at Massa and Meribah. You know, remember, Massa and Meribah is a place where the people rebel against God because they're thirsty, and ultimately it's kind of a test, and God will deliver water from a rock. There isn't really, in the Torah itself, up to this point, any indication that the tribe of Levi had anything to do with that. So maybe it's another tradition, it's not clear, but there were certainly places where the tribe of Levi stood out and stood up for God. And you see that most notably with the golden calf, which isn't mentioned here, but that's kind of their defining moment, that they do not participate in that. And of course, according to rabbinic tradition, women also don't participate in the golden calf, and they're later rewarded with their own holiday, which is Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so how faithful was the tribe of Levi? He said of his father and his mother, I consider them not. His brothers he disregarded, he ignored his own children. The tribe of Levi, and this is a metaphor here, their loyalty to God even transcends their loyalty to family, right? Your precepts alone they observed, they kept your covenant, and therefore, what is their role going forward? They will teach your laws to Jacob, your instructions to Israel. So the tribe of Levi now begins. We saw in the Torah a different vision, right? Moses is the lawgiver, and you get the instruction, and then we have that scene with Jethro, Richo, his father-in-law, and he says, "You're wearing yourself out." We'll have other people who will instruct, or be judges. But here we have it sense that the tribe of Levi and Moses, of course, was a Levite. The tribe of Levi are the ones who are going to teach people the laws. And that's the other thing that they do is they will offer your incense to savor your whole offerings from your altar, right? A dual role, teachers and sacrificers, right? They do the cult and they teach the people. And bless, O Lord, his substance and favor his undertakings. What does it mean to bless his substance? It means make sure that he has a lot, that the tribe enjoys plenty, right? That they will have material well-being. Remember that the tribe of Levi is a tribe without land. When the land is apportioned to the tribes, Levi doesn't get any land. Their role is to be scattered among the people, and therefore you can see this instructional role, right? And then they are the ones who serve in Jerusalem later on, who have that cultic function. So therefore they need material, and sometimes the tribes could allot them land that they could use, or they give them tithes, but the sense is that they need God's blessings. And then again, smite the enemies of his foes, let his enemies rise no more. So that's physical safety and economic safety. So the tribe of Levi really gets a blessing here. I mean, if you compare the tribe of Levi to Reuben, who got a line, they get a lot. Of Benjamin, he said, all right, Yedid Adonai, he is the beloved of the Lord, right? So remember that Benjamin was also Joseph's beloved brother, right? And there is a sense now, this idea, why would the tribe of Benjamin specifically be God's beloved, right? And of course, that's where the temple is, right? Jerusalem is, right, God's beloved city eventually, not till the time of David, nonetheless, eventually. And Solomon, actually, the king of Israel, his name, it's also Shlomo, but his name is Yedidyah, right? The beloved of Yah, the beloved of God. Okay. Okay, and he rests securely with him, ever does he protect him, and he rests on his between his shoulders. This is a sense that God is protecting them, and perhaps it's also a reference to the sanctuary that will be in Benjamin. Now we get a blessing for Joseph. Now there is no tribe of Joseph, right? There are two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, which in some sense are the tribe of Joseph. Remember, these are the names of his sons that are born to him in Egypt, and Jacob adopts them as his children, right? And he says, they will be like my other children. Who are the other tribes? So Joseph is going to drop out and be replaced by these two tribes. Here, Moses, when he talks about Joseph, is really blessing those two tribes. Of Joseph, he said, blessed of the Lord be his land, with bounty of dew from heaven and of the deep that crouches below, right? Dew from heaven and the deep below, all of this water, fertility, bounteous yield of the sun and the crop of the moons, right? Again, plenty. And these tribes will be eventually in a very fertile place with the best of the ancient mountains, the bounty of hills immortal, with the beauty of earth in its fullness. And the favor of the presence in the bush, may these rest on the head of Joseph. So that the presence in the bush, right, is a strange name, right? Shochnei Sneh, right? One who, in some sense, dwells in the bush. And of course, when we think about dwelling in a bush, what do we think about? We think about the burning bush, right? That's where God's presence is manifest in some sense within a bush. Moses is distracted, he goes and looks at it, and that's where God speaks to Moses for the first time and challenges him to go and to bring the people out of Egypt. So there is a sense here that Moses, at the beginning of Moses's career, we have a reference to this bush, and now in Moses's parting words to the people at the end of the book, again, we have a reference to God as a bush. May these rest on the head of Joseph, on the crown of the elect of his brothers. Like a firstling bull in his majesty, he has horns like the horns of the wild ox. With them he gores people, the ends of the earth, one and all. And then we get, in case you were unclear, these are the myriads of Ephraim, the thousands of Manasseh, right? So many, unlike like when we had a reference to Reuven, who's few in number, here we have a sense that these are really big tribes. And now we get to a blessing of Zvulun. Rejoice, O Zvulun, in your journeys, and Issachar in your tents. So two different tribes. When we talk about Zvulun, and we talk about Zvulun's journeys, we're really talking that part of Israel, because that was their inheritance, which is on the seacoast. Zvulun is the seafaring tribe, and these journeys are journeys out to sea. Issachar, however, is they're herdsmen, right? So they are in their tents. They invite their kin to the mountain where they offer sacrifices of success. Not clear what the mountain is, but if you look at the territory, it may well be Mount Tabor. It's a very large mountain that kind of sticks up out of the plain. They draw from the riches of the sea, right? And here that's clearly Zvulun, and the hidden hordes of the sand. And now on to God, right? And God, he said, blessed be he who enlarges God. Poised is he like a lion to tear off arm and scalp. He chooses for himself the best, for there is a portion of the revered chieftain where the heads of the people come. He executed the Lord's judgment and his decisions for Israel. Very military in its context. And we're gonna look at the last couple. Before we do, I realize that I haven't stopped at all for your questions or comments. So if you have them, I welcome them. I know this is just poetic. It's Sandy, are you? I don't know if you stand by your
I was
glass.
wait until you finish your sentence. So, Joseph's sons Manasseh and Ephraim were from the Egyptian. He married an Egyptian. Is that right? So are they considered Jewish, or how does that work?
It's considered Jewish for two reasons. The first reason is that in the Bible, it seems that identity goes through the father. See lots of examples of that. This idea of matriarchal descent, that if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish, is not a biblical idea.
Oh.
It comes later in Jewish history. I will say, though, the Reform movement has looked back to the Bible and they've said, well, patriarchal descent. So whether it's your mother or your father, we will consider you Jewish, but that's not what the Bible does. In either case, in biblical tradition or in rabbinic tradition, it's one, not two. I think the rabbinic tradition is interesting in that the mother determines whether you're a Jew, but the father determines what kind of Jew you are, whether it's Kohen or Israelite or a Levite. At any rate, but the significant thing, they are Jewish, but the significant thing is that they are adopted as heirs by Jacob and made the equivalent of the other tribes. So that's why they get land. And now there's the question of the 12 tribes. So if Joseph gets 2, looks like they're 13. Not a problem because we're going to take Levi out. Right? Levi's not going to have any land, right? So it goes up to 13 and then it comes back again to 12, right? So these are, now the other thing is that there is an idea with respect to the firstborn, and Joseph is not the firstborn, but he seems to have that preeminence, that in inheritance, the firstborn gets a double portion, right? So if when the family estate is divided, and there are, say, 3 sons, one of them gets half, and then each of the others gets a quarter, right? And this is, in some sense, a reflection of that idea, that Joseph is getting a double portion because there are 2 tribes, and each one will have their own portion or allocation. Other questions or comments? Saul, and then Hannah.
I'm looking at this, I'm comparing it to Vayechi.
Yes.
This is much more positive. But when you get to the tribe of Benjamin in Vayechi, he's like a wild animal, and here it's much, it's completely different. It's a big contrast to the read in Vayechi. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that going back to what I said before, this is really the emphasis here is very positive, and it's there's a general principle about Torah reading. That you're never, and the Haftorahs also, you're never supposed to end on a negative note, right? So much so that if you look, for example, at the Haftorah for Rosh Chodesh, the second to last line is then repeated at the end so that we don't end on a negative note. And I see that sort of reflected here in the career of Moses. This is not the way we want to remember Moses as this, this figure who's predicting doom and gloom, and there's a certain bitterness. Here we get words of blessing, and it's a nice way. And this is, of course, we're going to see at the end of this parsha, we're going to see Moses's farewell, his death. So this is literally the last thing that happens before Moses dies. Hannah.
Yeah, I wanted to say I appreciate very much that you're doing Zot HaBracha. That was my bat mitzvah part, the beginning part of it. And I never really studied it. So it's really great to hear about it and think about it.
Bat mitzvah and Simchat Torah.
It's, many times a year it comes up.
Right, because it's not ready time.
Nachum knew which part to get me.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's go back. I think we left off with Don. We're on page 1208, it's verse 22. And here we get this idea of Dan, who is Gur Aryeh, a lion's whelp that forth from Bashan. This sense of a lion as a symbol of power, who's rushing off now. And there is a military connotation here also, as there is in much of the rest of it. And then we get Naphtali, who is sated with favor. That it's such an interesting image, right? That sated, the sense of being full, sense of satisfaction with God's favor, full of the Lord's blessing, take possession of the west and the south. And now we get to Asher. This is the final one. Most blessed of sons be Asher. May he be the favorite of his brothers. May he dip his foot in oil. It's a sort of strange statement. The tribe of Asher will inherit the hills of Galilee. And that's where the oil comes from in the land of Israel. I mean, it's planted all over, olive trees are planted all over, but that area is particularly known for its oil. And like when we talked about Zvulun and we're talking about the riches of the sea, here I think the reference, because of the territory, is to oil. May your doorbolts be iron and copper, your security last all your days. So wealth and also security, right? A dual blessing. And now we finished. So we had a little introduction, then we had blessings to the individual tribes, and now Moses will speak to the people as a whole. And Ein Ka'el Yeshurun, Yeshurun, there is none like God. You could also, so in other words, you could read it, there is none, the Hebrew is, there is none like God, O Yeshurun, right? So you could also read it, there is none like Yeshurun's God, right? The God of Yeshurun, because Israel and Yeshurun, remember, are equivalent, right? So in other words, I could be telling the people of Israel that there is none like God, right? Very similar, the phrase, very similar to Ein Kamocha, right? There is none like you, right? There's none like God, O Yeshurun, or there is none like Yeshurun's God. And then we get this image riding through the heavens to help you, right? The same imagery we had earlier, though this is more explicit, right? Maybe on a chariot or a cloud, through the skies is his majesty. The ancient God is his refuge, ancient really in the sense of ever living. A support are the arms everlasting, right? God is supporting you. He drove out the enemy before you, by his command destroy. Thus Israel dwells in safety, untroubled is Jacob's abode, in a land of grain and wine, under heaven's dripping dew. O happy Israel, right? Mi chamocha. Who is like you, a people delivered by the Lord. Now notice that we said to Yeshurun, to the people of Israel, there is none like you, your God. And here we're saying there is none like God's people, Israel, right? Who is like you, a people delivered by God. God is your protection, right? Your shield, your help. Triumphant, your enemies shall cringe before you, and you will tread on their backs. So we finished now Moses's farewell blessing, and we are coming up now to Moses's death. And that's what we're going to read next as we come to the very end of the Torah. So Moses went up from the steppes of Moab to Mount Nebo, but that's where he's going to die, to the summit of Pisgah, opposite Jericho, because that's where they are, that's where the people is. And the Lord showed him the whole land. Gilead as far as Dan, Naphtali to the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the whole land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, the valley of Jericho, city of palm trees as far as Zohar. So Moses is up there. The promise was he'd get to see the land. And the description here, he sees it all. I mean, standing on the top of a mountain, he doesn't have, by the way, he doesn't have binoculars either, right? So it's really hard to envision how this is actually possible. And there's a wonderful midrash, which attempts to answer that question by looking back to the very beginning of Genesis. Right. Now you remember that in the very beginning of Genesis, the first thing that God does on the first day, Yehior, let there be light. Right. And then we get to the fourth day, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. So what happened to the light? The only light we know, right, as human beings, was the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars. So the rabbis say, what happened to the first light? And the answer is the first light has been stored away for the righteous. And they use, as a proof text for that, something which you might know because it's from a psalm that we sing as part of the Friday night service, or Zaruah Latzadik. Right? Light is sown for the righteous. So how does Moses see the entire land of Israel? That light, which was stored away for the righteous, is given to Moses at this moment, and he gets to see it all. Okay, so God shows him the entire land, and the Lord says to him, this is the land I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will assign it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross there, right? And one is tempted to say that Moses's life has a tragic end. Imagine leading this people through the desert, dealing with every complaint, and now with the goal in sight, he doesn't get to experience it. And there are a variety of ways that one can understand this. One is that he's not a military guy. He's not, the first sight we'll have of Joshua, and I'm not sure we're going to get to these things this time, but we'll do it as part of the introduction of the book of Joshua next time when we start it. The first thing we know about Joshua is with the battle with Amalek, and Moses is holding up his hands, and he gets tired. And who is it who supports his arms so that they will succeed? Joshua and Hur. Joshua is responsible in some sense, though Moses is. Joshua is responsible. So Joshua is the military guy. Joshua is the kind of leader necessary at this moment. Second way of understanding this is no one is above the law. God charged Moses with something. Moses didn't do it. In fact, didn't do it in a way which the text suggests reflects badly on God. Despite everything, no one is above the law. I want to also suggest something else, and we'll come to that as we come to the very end. Okay. And then it says, and Moses, the servant of God, died there. Moses, his epithet, the servant of God. That was his life. He served God. And the word eved here, right? Servant, also used for slave, right? God was his master. And he died in the Eretz Moab, in the land of Moab, al pi Adonai. Now the translation here is at the command of the Lord. But he is really a form of peh, of mouth. So there's a wonderful rabbinic midrash that God kissed Moses and he died. Right? What a beautiful image. Is Moses is the loyal servant, and in the end, God takes Moses's life with a kiss. Okay, and then he is buried there in the land of Moab near Bet Peor. No one knows his burial place to this day. So it's important, it seems, that no one knows where Moses is buried. And we do know where other people are buried. In fact, a great deal is made out of the fact that Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, we know where they were buried. They were buried in Hebron. They were buried in the cave of the Machpelah. Moses, we don't know. And there is, at least, there are a variety of ways to explain this. One of them is a sense that Moses's tomb should not become a place of pilgrimage, tomb outside the land of Israel, and that Moses should not be, in that process of going to the tomb, elevated to a higher status, even though he was God's loyal servant. Kind of people will go there in a sense, worship Moses, ask Moses to intercede for them before God, all those kinds of things. So now, he was 120 years when he died, right? That's the magic number, the number that we all ascribe to. His eyes were undimmed, his vigor unabated. He's still strong. In other words, he doesn't die of natural causes. And his eyes undimmed reminds us of patriarchs whose eyes were dimmed. And, thinking famously of the story of Isaac, right, who Jacob is able to trick because his eyes are so dim that Jacob can convince him that he is Esau rather than Jacob. His vigor unabated, and the Israelites bewailed Moses in the steppes of Moab for 30 days. 30 days is the magic number now for mourning. And of course, that was adapted by the Jewish tradition for everyone, and that's shloshim, right? That some form of mourning goes on through shloshim. Parents, the mourning is longer, right? It goes on through the year. But for most relatives, it's 30 days, right? The first 7 being the most intense Shiva. But so here Moses becomes the kind of paradigm for that. And the period of mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, right? You need wisdom. You need military practice. You need smarts in order to run the military. You need wisdom in order to be a judge, right? This is what Solomon prayed for when Solomon became king. He asked God for wisdom. He could have asked him for all kinds of things. He asked him for wisdom. Why? Because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites heeded him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. So they accept Joshua now after Moses' death. And now we get a final eulogy. Never lokam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe, right? Never again did there rise in Israel a prophet like Moses, right? You probably are familiar with a slightly different formulation of this. It's in Yigdal, in that hymn, Lo kam b'Yisrael k'Moshe od Navi, right? Who the Lord singled out, panim el panim, face to face, right? The relationship that God has with Moses is unlike that of any other prophet. It is direct, it is unmediated. Famous rabbinic passage says that Moses saw God clearly, and the other prophets see God through like a darkened glass. They don't see God distinctly. Now, of course, we're not talking about literally seeing God, but experiencing God. And here, mouth to mouth, as one human would display another. For God singled him out for the various signs and portents the land sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed L'Einei Kol Yisrael, in the eyes or before the whole people of Israel. And it's striking that the last word in the Torah is Yisrael. It is the people of Israel. It's a book which concludes with that, with the nation complete, the patriarchs, descendants, they are now poised to go into the land as they will under Joshua. And we can say now, Chazek, Chazek, Benit Chazak. We have done it. We finished the book of Deuteronomy and by extension, the Torah. So I had hoped to introduce Joshua this week, but I'll do it next week. Next week, we're going to talk about a number of things. I'll just tell you what they are. I want to talk about the place of the book of Joshua at the beginning of what are usually called the prophets and why that is. I want to talk about various places in the Torah where we saw Joshua and various roles that he took. I want to talk a little bit about the question of how historical the book of Joshua is. Are the things depicted something that's really much later reflection back? Do they reflect the realities of the land of Israel in the time that, which is like the 13th century before the Common Era in that time? So we'll look at all that, and then we will get in, I think, to the text itself. I'm going to open it up if there are any closing questions. Sandy, and then Saul. Unmute, please. Sandy can't hear you.
I think, Rabbi, you said that you were going to give another reason when you got to it why Moses did not go into the promised land.
So what I want to say is this. Thank you for, I think it's not quite a reason, but I said that Moses, in some sense, gets a raw deal, right? One could say that at the end of all this. But look at who Moses is. He is the one who knew God face to face, right? He is the one who brought the law. It says, never again will there be a prophet like Moses. It's really not about the destination, right? And I think if you think about Moses's legacy, right, it's not a sad story. I don't think Moses gets a raw deal, because look who he is. And I think in this final passage, this sort of eulogy for Moses, we really see a reflection of his greatness. And compared to that, I mean, we still read these words, right? We are thousands of years later talking about Moses, talking about what he did. So, I don't think he got a raw deal. Okay, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of that, Saul. Did you? Somebody did.
Yeah, Shimon is not mentioned at all, and according to what I'm reading in Hertz, his territory was included in the territory of Yehuda. But I wonder if there are any other reasons besides the fact that he was, that he killed the Sidon.
Shimon and Levi, of course, are a pair. Also, going back to the story of Dinah, I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Sometimes what is missing is as significant as what's there. Thanks for picking that up. I'll try to come back to it at the very beginning next week, or I'll email out with the notice some thoughts on that. Just making myself a note. Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, well, we say goodbye to Torah. We will start next week, the book of Joshua, moving on. I had made some suggestions as to text. Francesca also mentioned that I could take Sepharia and simply project it. I'm not sure I want to do that for a variety of reasons. But I'll think about that. I will be sending out an email with information about, and I've mentioned some of them, but ways to access the book of Joshua. So at this point,
I have a question. Well, actually, a comment. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so those of us that belong to B'nai Shalom, I was able to borrow a copy of the Tanakh from the rabbi because apparently we have a bunch of copies in the library. So I now have one that I can borrow until we're done with Joshua. And I know he had more than one. So if anyone else on this call is from B'nai Shalom, or check your shul, maybe they might have copies that can borrow.
That's a really great suggestion. I think a lot of synagogues, and I remember Hewlett's Rockaway Jewish Center, where I was before I came here. You went into the library, there were lots of copies of the Tanakh. People sort of left them. You know, it's not something you could dispose of. So that's a really good idea. And thanks for suggesting it.
Yeah, the one that I borrowed says Congregation Beth Shalom, Teaneck, New Jersey. This was after someone's grandson had graduated from high school, June 1995.
Yeah, so that is something that happens, you know. Often people move and they have them with them, and you know, so it goes. And then they leave the synagogue, they move, and they can't throw them out, so they bring them to the synagogue, and the synagogue winds up with them. Okay, so a good week, and Joshua and I will see you next week.
Excellent. Thanks for a great
Thank you.
class as usual. Bye.
Thank you, Rev.